The day my son showed up at my door with a lawyer, I realized I had been fooling myself for a long time. Not about him, exactly. I'd seen the signs. I just kept finding reasons to look the other way. My name is Arthur, and I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the city of Edmonton. Roads, bridges, drainage systems. The kind of infrastructure most people never think about until something goes wrong. I retired 4 years ago with a decent pension, a paid-off house in the west end of the city, and a portfolio my financial advisor at RBC had helped me build carefully over 2 decades. I wasn't wealthy in the way that gets you into magazines, but I was comfortable, more than comfortable. I had options, and I knew it. My son Connor is 41. He lives about 20 minutes from me, in a newer subdivision out near Spruce Grove. He married a woman named Darlene about 6 years ago, his second marriage, her first. They have a daughter together, my granddaughter Isla, who just turned 4 and is the light of every room she walks into. I love that little girl fiercely. I want to be clear about that before I tell you the rest of this story, because by the end, some of you might think I'm a cold man. I'm not. I just learned, too late, and then just barely in time, that love and trust are 2 different things entirely. Connor and I were always close when he was young. After his mother I divorced, he was 11, his sister Pauline was 8. I made it a point to be present. Every weekend, every school play, every hockey practice out at the rink on Saturday mornings when it was -20 and still dark. I drove him to university in Lethbridge, helped him move 3 times in his 20s, co-signed on his first car loan when his credit was still being rebuilt from a rough patch. In his mid-20s I won't get into here. We had a good relationship, or I thought we did. The shift started small. It always does, I think. About 2 years into my retirement, Connor started calling more often. At first I was glad. I figured retirement had given me more time and he was making use of it, which was fine with me. We'd grab breakfast at a diner near my place every couple of weeks. He'd ask how things were going, how I was spending my time, whether I was keeping busy. Normal conversation. Nice, even. Then the questions got more specific. Do you still have the same guy at RBC? Or did you ever switch? What does your pension actually work out to monthly, after taxes? Have you thought about whether the house is too big for just you? You'd free up a lot of equity if you downsized. Each question, on its own, I could explain away as concern. He was worried about me rattling around a 4-bedroom house by myself. He wanted to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of by some financial advisor. That's what I told myself. Fathers do that. We make excuses for our kids even when they're adults, maybe especially when they're adults. Because by then you've invested so much of yourself in them that admitting something is off feels like admitting a failure of your own. It was my neighbor, a retired RCMP officer named Douglas, who finally said it plainly. We were standing in my driveway one evening last October. The leaves had come down and I was raking, and he'd wandered over the way he sometimes did. We'd been neighbors for 14 years, and we had that easy kind of friendship that doesn't require much ceremony. He said, "You know, my daughter-in-law's family went through something a few years back. Father in his 70s. Kids kept asking about the will, asking about accounts. By the time he figured out what was happening, 2 of them had joint access to his checking account, and he'd signed something he didn't fully understand." He wasn't talking about me directly. He wasn't that blunt. But he looked at me when he said it, and I understood what he was doing. I went inside, and I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the questions. I thought about the time Connor had asked, very casually, whether I'd ever consider putting him on my bank accounts, just in case something happened. I thought about how he'd brought up power of attorney twice in the past year and a half, in a tone that made it sound like an obvious, practical thing any sensible older person would have already handled. I thought about how he'd mentioned more than once that Darlene's parents had set everything up for their kids early, implying I was somehow behind, and I thought about Pauline. Pauline is my daughter, Connor's younger sister. She lives in Halifax with her husband and their 2 boys. She's a nurse practitioner, busy as anyone I know, and we talk every Sunday evening. She had said something to me months earlier that I'd filed away and not examined. She'd said, "Dad, I don't really know what your wishes are for your estate. I don't want to push you on it, but maybe at some point you should talk to someone. A lawyer, maybe. Not for my sake, just so that you know everything is set up the way you want it." That was the difference, I realized. Pauline said, "the way you want it." Connor never said that. Connor always found ways to steer the conversation toward what would be easier, what would make sense, what would simplify things. Simple for whom was never quite stated. I called a lawyer. Her name is Sandra, and she works with an estates and trusts firm downtown that was recommended to me by my financial advisor. I made an appointment in November, and I went in on a Tuesday afternoon, and I sat across from her and told her everything I just told you. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "You were right to come in. Let's look at what you have and make sure it's protected the way you intend." We spent 3 appointments going through everything. My will, which was 15 years old and needed updating. My RRSP beneficiary designations, some of which were outdated. My ex-wife's name was still on one of them, which was a problem. My pension survivor benefits. The house, a small rental property I own in St. Albert that I'd inherited from my own father years ago. Sandra explained my options clearly, without pressure. She helped me understand what a proper power of attorney looked like and what it meant. And she made sure I had one drawn up on my terms, naming Pauline, who I trust without reservation. She also said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "Financial abuse of older adults is one of the most underreported problems we deal with. And the people who do it usually aren't strangers. They're family members who've convinced themselves they're just being practical." I drove home that day, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I thought about whether I was being fair to Connor. Whether I was reading too much into things. Whether I was being a paranoid old man who was pushing his son away over nothing. Then my phone rang. It was Connor. He asked if I'd thought any more about putting him on the accounts. He said it again. Just in case something happened. I said I'd think about it. I didn't sleep well that night. The months between November and March were strange. I kept things normal on the surface. Connor and I still had breakfast occasionally. I still saw Isla when I could, took her to the Valley Zoo in the spring when the animals were coming back out. I didn't tell Connor I'd been to a lawyer. I didn't tell him I'd updated my will or drawn up a power of attorney. I just kept things quiet and I paid attention. I noticed that when I didn't bring up money or my estate, he found ways to bring it up himself. I noticed that Darlene had started asking questions too, in the careful way people do when they've talked about something beforehand. At Isla's 3rd birthday party, Darlene had said, "Connor mentioned you have a place in St. Albert. Is that something you're planning to hold on to? Or?" And then left the sentence unfinished. In that particular way, that means the rest of it is very much finished in their heads. I noticed that Connor mentioned, twice, that he and Darlene were in a tight spot financially. Once without details and once with a vague reference to some investments that hadn't worked out. He didn't ask me for anything directly. He never did. It was always framing, setup, creating the conditions for the ask. I recognized it because I'd seen it before, in negotiations at work. You get the other party thinking a certain way before you make your move. The move came in March. It was a Saturday afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. The snow had finally started pulling back, and I'd been outside in the backyard, looking at the state of my garden beds, thinking about what I'd plant in the spring. The doorbell rang and I went around the front, and there was Connor. And standing beside him was a man in a gray wool coat, carrying a leather folder. "Dad," Connor said, "this is Mr. Hendricks. He's a legal professional who's helped us put some things together. We just wanted to go over a few documents with you. Won't take long." That sentence, "won't take long," is still the one that stays with me. As if the entire restructuring of an old man's estate is a quick errand. As if what they were about to ask me to sign was as simple as a permission slip. I looked at Connor. He was smiling the careful smile of someone who has rehearsed this. I looked at the man in the gray coat. He gave me a brief nod. I said, "Come in." We went to the dining room. Mr. Hendricks opened his leather folder and laid out several pages on the table. I didn't pick them up right away. I asked if either of them wanted coffee. Connor said no. Mr. Hendricks said no. I went and made myself a cup anyway, slowly, because I needed a moment and because I wanted them to know that I was not in any hurry and that this was my house. When I sat back down, Mr. Hendricks began explaining the documents. There was a lot of language about simplifying estate management and reducing probate complications and ensuring continuity of asset oversight in the event of incapacity. I listened. I asked 2 or 3 clarifying questions, and then I said, these would give Connor control over the St. Albert property and signing authority over my investment accounts. Is that right? Mr. Hendricks paused. He said, in simplified terms, yes. I nodded. Then I said, just a moment. I got up from the table and walked down the hall to the small room I use as a home office. I knocked twice on the closed door. The door opened. Sandra stepped out. I had called her 2 days earlier. I told her I had a feeling something was coming, and I asked if she'd be willing to be at my house on Saturday afternoon. She said she would. She'd been sitting in my office for 40 minutes with a cup of tea and her own files, waiting. When she walked into the dining room, Connor's face changed. I watched it happen. The color went out of it in a way I'd never seen before. Mr. Hendricks looked at her and then at me, and I could see him reassessing the entire situation in real time. Sandra introduced herself, gave Mr. Hendricks her card, and sat down across from him. She said, I've been retained by Mr. Whitfield to review any documents related to his estate and financial accounts. I'd like to take a look at what you've brought today. She picked up the pages from the table. She read through them without speaking. The room was very quiet. Connor didn't look at me. After a few minutes, Sandra set the pages down and said, Mr. Whitfield, you are under no obligation to sign any of these today or at any point. These documents, as written, would transfer significant financial authority in ways that go well beyond standard estate planning. You should know that. I said, I know. Mr. Hendricks began to say something about timing and how these things were standard practice, and Sandra let him finish, and then she walked through, clause by clause, exactly what each document would and would not allow. Her voice was even and professional and entirely clear. By the time she was done, there was nothing left to argue. Connor said, Dad, I wasn't trying to. I held up my hand, not angry, just final. I said, I know you love Isla. I know things have been hard. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why you're here, but this isn't the way. He started to say something else. I said, we'll talk another time, not today. Mr. Hendricks gathered his folder. He and Connor left. Sandra stayed another half hour, made sure I was all right, and then she left too. I stood at my living room window and watched Connor's car pull away. He didn't look back. I kept my hand flat on the windowsill because I needed something steady under it. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after, because I think that part matters too. Pauline called me that Sunday, the way she always does. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then she said, Oh, Dad. Not accusing, not triumphant, just sad the way you are when something you feared turns out to be real. She flew in to see me in April. We sat in the kitchen and talked for hours about the estate, about Connor, about what we both wanted for the family, about Isla. We talked about what had gone wrong with Connor a long time before this, in ways I hadn't let myself examine. The second marriage, the failed investments, the debt I now understood, was more serious than I'd been led to believe. I didn't cut Connor off. I want to be honest about that. I'm still his father. I still answer when he calls. He called in May, and we had a difficult conversation. And at the end of it, he apologized in a way that sounded like he meant most of it. I don't know yet what that means for us. I don't know if we get back to where we were. I don't know if where we were was even as solid as I thought it was. What I know is this. I own a house in Edmonton that is mine. I have a pension that goes where I want it to go. I have a will that reflects what I actually want. I have a power of attorney signed by someone I trust with my whole heart. I have a granddaughter I intend to know for as many years as I'm given. And I have a neighbor who stopped me in my own driveway and told me a story that wasn't about me, but was. I'm 68 years old. I built things my entire career. Things meant to last. Things meant to carry weight. Bridges hold because every connection point is sound. I understand that better now than I ever did when I was drawing the plans. The strongest thing you can do for the people you love is to know exactly what you have, know exactly what you want done with it, and make sure the paperwork reflects the person you actually are, not the person someone else needs you to be for their own reasons. I learned that later than I should have, but I learned it in time.